It's not free, though. I mean, there is a perception that the internet is free. It isn't, though. I mean,
No,
it's the private space is owned by major, huge corporations.
And not only that, but entry to the internet, it goes through a small number of portals, and those are handed over to the private capital. That's an interesting development, incidentally. The internet, of course, developed in the state sector. For the fact where I worked in, around 1960, and then it was under the Pentagon for years, and then it was completely free. And then it was handed over to the National Science Foundation, still was free. It was privatized in 1995 under circumstances that are still somewhat obscure. That, in principle, puts control into the hands of several small number of private entities. Now, will they exert that control? Well, to some extent they have. Take, say, WikiLeaks. The funding for WikiLeaks went through the internet, but the major channels like PayPal, Amazon, and so on, they just cut it off. Well, that's private censorship of a very serious kind. The public didn't want it cut off, but you had to find sort of devious ways to keep it alive. In fact, it's driven it underground pretty much. And it can do the same for opinion, and there are other things too. There are many devices available to sort of direct people in towards particular options. I mean, the public relations industry has had 100 years of experience on what they call creating wants, directing people's attitudes and opinions, and that's all there. So yes, those things are there, but in principle it's still free.
What is net neutrality? It has nothing to do with a volleyball or a tennis court. The net refers to the internet, something that's become as necessary as water and power for most of us. The neutrality part is about keeping the net the way it is today. It's a set of rules the FCC approved in 2010 to prevent speed traps on the information superhighway. In other words, speeding up access to some sites and slowing down access to others, or blocking certain sites entirely. So are these rules a bad thing? It depends who you ask. The companies that deliver your internet, like Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T, have spent millions in lobbying money to get rid of net neutrality, arguing that having the government micromanage their business is not good for them or their consumers. On the other side are internet giants like Facebook and Google, streaming services like Netflix, and President Obama. They all argue the internet is a public good and should be regulated like one. They also say the companies that own the pipelines can play favorites. For example, a content provider like Netflix is in direct competition with Comcast, which owns NBC Universal and controls access to the internet for more than 20 million customers. You can imagine a scenario where NBC might want to speed up streams of its shows and slow down streams of its rival Netflix. Now, Netflix can afford to pay for a fast lane. They make $4 billion a year. But the next Netflix, some awesome startup, can't. So where do things stand today? It all comes down to the FCC and the position they'll take on this heated issue. Giant companies, millions of internet users, and the president are all awaiting their decision.
FCC Chairman Ajit Pai is officially preparing for an all-out assault on our nation's net neutrality regulations. Now, this is something that we all knew was coming sooner or later, but the time with which this is actually going to be happening is upon us very soon. We're talking May, we're talking possibly June, that he will be launching his assault on the internet. So according to The Verge, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has briefed telecom trade associations on his plans to scale back net neutrality rules, the Wall Street Journal reports. Pai's plans will apparently maintain the basic concept of net neutrality, but will move the enforcement of the rules back to the Federal Trade Commission rather than the FCC. But while the Wall Street Journal says Pai's plans will preserve the basic principles of net neutrality, giving oversight of the broadband industry back to the FTC would likely end Title II net neutrality as we know it. In order to do its job under Pai's proposed rules, the FTC would need Title II to be rolled back, as the body is prohibited from investigating common carriers, exactly the kind of enterprise ISPs are qualified as under current rules. It's not yet clear when Pi's plans would come into play, but the Wall Street Journal says it could be as soon as May at the FCC's monthly meeting. The June meeting is also a possibility, but Democrats and other net neutrality advocates are likely to raise objections when Pi's concrete plans become public. So notice here what he's doing. It's really sneaky. He's trying to say that, by giving the FTC the authority to enforce net neutrality rules, he's not actually doing away with the rules themselves. He's just handing authority of the enforcement of said rules over to the FTC, which will not enforce those rules. So, he's still getting rid of net neutrality. He's just trying to do it in a really slimy way, so that way you don't think he's doing away with net neutrality. It's called doublespeak. This is something that George Orwell basically warned us about in 1984, and we are seeing it right now. Now, one thing to mention doublespeak that I want to talk about is, do you know how Republicans recently voted away your right to online privacy? Well, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai actually co-wrote an article in the Washington Post titled, "No, Republicans didn't just strip away your internet privacy rights." And in it, he assures us that internet service providers have never planned to sell your individual browsing history to third parties. So let me just say how egregious it is that the Washington Post is now literally publishing propaganda for the government, but this makes no sense. So basically, the telecommunications industry lobbied Congress, Republicans specifically, to allow them to sell our privacy information without our consent, all for nothing. They lobbied them to get this power now, just so they can do nothing with it. That's basically what he's saying by making this argument. How stupid do you think we are, Ajit? How dumb do you think the average American is? And what he's telling us here is that we should trust the internet service providers that rip us off every single month. And it's not like they weren't already selling out our personal information to third parties, right? Oh wait, they were already doing that. So prior to these rules being repealed, they were already doing that, but he's telling us that they would never sell our browsing history. So silly us to think that, we couldn't trust these internet service providers like Comcast, who have been selling our information without our consent prior to the rules. But this guy he's particularly dangerous. I'd say he's more dangerous than Tom Wheeler, because even though Tom Wheeler also tried to roll back net neutrality rules and proposed fast lanes, he was more open about it. Like he called it fast lanes, but that was brazenly bullshit. But what he's doing, he's saying, I'm not rolling back net neutrality rules. I'm giving the FTC the authority to enforce net neutrality rules, which is technically true, but we all know what's going to happen. So this is a roundabout way that Ajit Pai, who came from the industry, he was a lawyer for Verizon, is going to give his corporate donors what they've been looking for forever. So here's what we've got to do. We've got to act quickly. So in the description box, there will be a link to a page on the Humanist Report website that will provide you with a ton of links and resources and information about how you can get in touch with the FCC and file an official complaint. You can email them, you can call them. And look, I'm begging you to please do this if you care about the internet. This doesn't benefit me. There's not a single ad being run on this page. So if you're a conservative who hates Mike, who hates the Humanist Report, but likes the free and open internet to remain the way it is right now, follow those links and file a complaint. You don't even have to go to my website. I just try to make it easier for people so they would be more inclined to speak out. But just please file an official complaint. You can do that. You can call the FCC and you can make a difference, because we stopped the FCC from implementing their anti-net neutrality agenda before. And best believe, if we all come together on the left and the right and put pressure on them, we can do it again. It's not impossible, but I think it's going to be more difficult this time, because what we're dealing with is someone who is very slimy, who is very disingenuous, who is lying and deceiving the American people at the behest of broadband internet service providers. It's disgusting. So if these changes are coming in May or June, like they're saying they will be potentially, we act now. We have to act now. We can't wait until they're proposed, even though I know that the internet itself probably won't react until the rules are proposed. But we've got to stop them from even being proposed, because this guy's going to fight us tooth and nail. But we have to let him know that we won't back down and that we're strong, and that as an internet, we're all going to come together to stop corporations from making the internet a place where it's no longer free, it's no longer fair, where they can censor content and websites that they disagree with. We already see YouTube demonetizing videos that talk about Syria, for example, while promoting CBS News videos about Syria. So we don't need any more censorship on the internet, and the buck stops with us. We can stop this. We just have to come together and do it and put pressure on them and be strong.
There was an article in The Intercept by Li Fang, and it was titled, "Civil Rights Groups Funded by Telecoms Back Donald Trump's Plan to Kill Net Neutrality." And we know net neutrality is on the chopping block, potentially. Obama saved it, and now the telecom industry, Comcast and the like, they are looking to kill it. The new nominee of the Federal Communications Commission, his name... Ajit Pai is his name.
Yeah.
So this story I thought was really interesting because what Li Fang writes about is the way that the telecom industry has funded various civil rights groups over the years, and all of a sudden these civil rights groups are now coming out supporting the telecom industry position on net neutrality.
Money talks, baby.
We have the first. I think I have some graphics.
So that, to me, this is like the veterans when they came out against Prop 61. Remember Prop 61, Bernie's bill, where they would be able to negotiate drug prices like the veterans do, VA? And then they had commercials all over the place running in front of my videos on the Jimmy Dore Show with veterans going, "We're against this, you assholes," because they took money. Right? That's what this is.
The article begins, "Leading civil rights groups who for many years have been heavily bankrolled by the telecom industry are signaling their support for Donald Trump's promised rollback of the Obama administration's net neutrality rules, which prevent internet service providers from prioritizing some content providers over others." Next quote. In a little noticed joint letter released last week, the NAACP, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, OCA, formerly known as the Organization for Chinese Americans, the National Urban League, and other civil rights organizations sharply criticized the jurisdictional and classificational problems that plagued the last FCC, a reference to the legal mechanism used by the Obama administration to accomplish net neutrality. Next is, instead of classifying broadband as a public utility, the letter states, open internet rules should be written by statute. What does that mean? It means the Republican-led Congress should take control of the process, the precise approach that is favored by industry. Last one, I think, one or two more. The civil rights group opposed to net neutrality, the civil rights groups opposed to net neutrality have employed several arguments against the proposal. In one filing made in 2010, the NAACP argued that net neutrality reforms were a waste of resources because the FCC should focus on more pressing racial discrimination and exclusionary hiring and promotion practices of certain Silicon Valley high-tech companies. In a separate filing in 2014, the NAACP argued that reclassification would threaten the fragile state of minority engagement in the digital ecosystem. While advocating against net neutrality, the organizations on the joint letter have raked in money from the telecom industry. The NAACP, which signed letters opposing net neutrality both times the rule was proposed by the Obama administration, has named AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast as corporate fundraising partners.
No shit. After
the NAACP endorsed Comcast's merger with NBC, what the fuck the NAACP is commenting on that for, who knows? Comcast disclosed that the NAACP was one of the recipients of $1.8 billion in funds doled out to various community groups. Well, there, I answered my own question. So what's going on here is that we have these civil rights groups that are getting funded by Verizon and Comcast, maybe not directly, but indirectly through industry groups that they, umbrella groups that they create. And then they take the money, and then these groups essentially call in that shit and say, hey, NAACP, we need you to support us on net neutrality, on ending net neutrality. And then NAACP says, well, net neutrality is not really that, that's not our issue. As long as Comcast is with us on, fighting discrimination in the workplace or whatever it is, then sure, we'll support you on that. But it is corrupt. It is money corrupting the NAACP.